At 7:30 on the morning of July 24, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit stood in USS Tinosa's conning tower, preparing to finish off a crippled Japanese tanker drifting helplessly just under 1,000 yards away. The ship had already taken 2 torpedo hits and lay dead in the water with no escorts in sight. It was the kind of ideal setup submarine commanders dreamed of: calm seas, a motionless target, and no pressure. Daspit eased Tinosa into a perfect firing position and ordered another shot. The torpedo struck the tanker with a loud metallic impact, echoing through Tinosa's hull. But there was no explosion. Confused, Daspit fired again. Same impact, same clang, still no detonation. Then he fired again, and again. 11 more torpedoes slammed directly into the tanker's hull, each one running perfectly and each one failing exactly the same way. The crew heard every hit as if someone were pounding a sledgehammer against the submarine's frame. Daspit had started with 16 torpedoes. 4 were used in his first salvo, and 2 of those had worked. Now 11 more had hit without exploding. 1 torpedo remained, and he refused to waste it. Daspit surfaced, ended the attack, and headed home with the last torpedo as evidence. He was returning to Pearl Harbor, determined to prove something was catastrophically wrong. What he didn't yet know was that this disastrous engagement would finally force the U.S. Navy to face an uncomfortable truth submarine crews had complained about since the war began. The Mark 14 torpedo was deeply flawed. It was running at the wrong depth, it detonated prematurely, and even when it hit a target squarely, the contact exploder often failed. For almost 2 years, these defects had crippled America's submarine force and allowed Japanese shipping to travel the Pacific with far less danger than it should have faced. The first commander to raise alarms had been Lieutenant Commander Tyrell Jacobs of USS Sargo, who in December 1941 had fired 8 torpedoes that clearly hit their targets but failed to explode. The Bureau of Ordnance insisted the fault lay with Jacobs' tactics, not the torpedoes. The same thing happened to Lieutenant Commander Richard Voge from USS Sailfish, who watched his shots pass beneath Japanese ships without detonating. Again, the Bureau rejected his report. As early 1942 unfolded, more captains reported strikes without detonations and torpedoes running too deep, but the pattern was dismissed as operator error. Over and over, commanders insisted the torpedoes were failing. Over and over, they were blamed for poor firing solutions. Everything changed when Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood took command of submarines in the Southwest Pacific. Unlike the bureaucrats in Washington, Lockwood trusted his captains. When they said torpedoes were failing, he believed them. And in June 1942, Lockwood quietly did what the Bureau refused to do: he ran tests himself. Using nets hung underwater near the Australian coast, he proved conclusively that the torpedoes were running far deeper than set, often more than 10 feet deeper. The Bureau dismissed the results anyway. Lockwood wasn't finished. He kept gathering reports, each one a piece of evidence pointing to the same conclusion. American submariners were being sent into combat with weapons that simply did not work. Still, the Bureau insisted the torpedoes were fine. It would take more failures, many more, before anyone in Washington would listen. Lockwood kept pushing because he knew the failures couldn't be coincidence. As more submarines returned with stories of torpedoes passing harmlessly under ships or exploding too early, he pressed harder. Even after he proved the depth-setting issue, the Bureau of Ordnance denied there was a flaw. But once depth was corrected, a new pattern emerged. Torpedoes were finally striking hulls more often, yet they still weren't exploding. That pointed to a second, even more serious defect: the magnetic influence exploder. The Mark 6 magnetic trigger was supposed to revolutionize naval warfare. It was designed to sense a ship's magnetic field and detonate beneath the keel, breaking the vessel in half with one perfect shot. But in the Pacific, where magnetic conditions differed from the test sites in Rhode Island, the trigger often misfired. Torpedoes exploded too soon or not at all. Lieutenant Commander John Scott aboard USS Tunney saw this firsthand when he fired a full spread at 3 Japanese carriers, only to watch multiple premature explosions light up the water before the torpedoes reached their targets. Worse, every premature explosion revealed the submarine's position. Instead of scoring hits, the faulty torpedoes summoned destroyers swarming toward the Sound. Lockwood urged higher command to deactivate the magnetic trigger entirely. Finally, in June 1943, Admiral Nimitz authorized submarines to switch it off. Yet with the magnetic trigger disabled, another failure became unmistakable. The contact exploder, the final fallback, was also broken. That defect became impossible to ignore after Daspit's Tinosa returned with a torpedo that had struck the Tonan Maru and bounced off without detonating. Lockwood personally met Daspit on the pier and saw the anger in his eyes. 11 perfect hits, 11 duds. The torpedo Daspit saved was dismantled and tested immediately, and what the technicians found explained everything. The contact mechanism's firing pin was too heavy and fragile. At a perfect 90-degree hit, exactly the angle submarine tactics emphasized, the sudden deceleration bent the firing pin so it jammed before striking the detonator. The harder the impact and the better the shot, the more likely the torpedo was to fail. Tests confirmed the problem. Torpedoes dropped onto steel plates at right angles failed again and again. Pearl Harbor's torpedo shop built a new firing pin from lightweight metal scavenged from downed Japanese aircraft. Within weeks, submarines at Pearl carried the improved design. By the fall of 1943, all three major defects, depth, magnetic trigger, and contact exploder, were fixed at last. It had taken nearly 2 years of combat failure, lost ships, and wasted opportunities to force the Bureau of Ordnance to accept reality. And the man who made it possible was Charles Lockwood. He fought bureaucratic resistance at every level. He ran unauthorized tests. He collected evidence until it was overwhelming. He backed his submarine commanders when no one else would. And when the Bureau still resisted, he flew to Washington and confronted them directly, refusing to let political pride cost more American lives. Once the technical problems were solved, Lockwood turned to the next obstacle, the commanders themselves. Early in the war, many skippers were cautious and unwilling to take risks. They followed pre-war doctrine, firing from long range, avoiding surface attacks, and withdrawing quickly after shooting. Lockwood began replacing hesitant commanders with aggressive ones. Men like Dudley Morton, Richard O'Kane, Samuel Dealey, and Eugene Fluckey. Leaders who treated submarines like offensive weapons, not fragile tools. Morton, commanding USS Wahoo, demonstrated what aggressive tactics could achieve. He believed every second counted, every shot mattered, and hesitation was deadly. On his early patrols, he attacked Japanese convoys with boldness unseen before. He shifted periscope duties to his executive officer so he could focus on overall battle coordination. He entered enemy harbors, fought in shallow seas, and used audacity to make up for faulty weapons. He showed the submarine force what was possible when a commander refused to be timid. As more officers followed his lead, Lockwood's vision took hold. Aggression became the standard. Commanders took the initiative on every patrol, drove deep into enemy territory, and treated every Japanese ship as a legitimate target. All they had needed were torpedoes that worked, and leaders willing to take the fight to the enemy. By late 1943, with working torpedoes and bold commanders in the field, the American submarine force finally became what it had always been meant to be: a relentless weapon aimed at the heart of Japan's economy. Sinkings surged almost immediately. In 1942, when the torpedoes barely functioned, submarines had sunk a little over 100 Japanese ships. In 1943, even with lingering issues, that number more than doubled. And in 1944, the year everything finally worked together, American submarines destroyed over 3 million tons of shipping, more than the previous 2 years combined. With torpedoes now reliable, submarines no longer had to fire wildly from long distances. Commanders closed the range, took risks, and executed the aggressive tactics Lockwood encouraged. They hunted near Japan's home islands, pushed into the Sea of Japan itself, and operated in coordinated wolf packs. Each patrol became more efficient. Each sinking had deeper consequences. Japan depended almost entirely on imported resources: oil, rubber, metals, food. Without merchant shipping, its industry, military, and population couldn't survive, and American submarines were cutting those supply lines in half. By early 1945, the results were catastrophic for Japan. Its merchant marine was effectively gone. Tankers were sunk faster than Japan could build them. Oil production stalled, refineries shut down, aircraft remained grounded not because they were damaged, but because there was no fuel to fly them. Warships stayed tied to docks for months at a time. The giant battleship Yamato barely left port in 1944 for lack of fuel, and when it finally sailed on its suicide mission to Okinawa, it carried only enough for a one-way trip. Factories starved for raw materials. Entire industries collapsed. Civilians went hungry. The Japanese war machine was dying, not from bombing alone, but from suffocation at sea. American submarines ultimately sank 55% of all Japanese ships lost in the war, more than every other branch of the U.S. military combined. They sank over 1,300 merchant ships and dozens of warships, including carriers and destroyers. The Japanese government later admitted in post-war testimony that the submarine campaign, more than any single military action, had destroyed the nation's ability to continue fighting. But these results came at a terrible price. Submarine duty was among the most dangerous in the American military. 52 submarines were lost. More than 3,500 submariners died, over a fifth of the entire force. Many boats vanished without a trace, struck by mines or destroyed in deep water where no wreckage could ever be found. Others died fighting, trapped beneath the sea. Crews knew the risks and volunteered anyway. Every patrol meant entering enemy waters with the constant threat of aircraft, destroyers, mines, or their own malfunctioning torpedoes. The casualty rate was 7 times higher than the average American serviceman. Yet the submariners kept going because they understood the mission's importance. Every ship they sank shortened the war. Every tanker lost weakened Japan's military. Every successful patrol saved lives elsewhere. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, Japan possessed some of the most advanced submarines in the world. They built enormous I-class boats, capable of launching aircraft, submarines faster than anything the Americans put to sea, and long-range raiders that could travel the full width of the Pacific without refueling. Their torpedoes worked from day one. Their crews were skilled and experienced, but they accomplished almost nothing. Japan's strategic error was profound. It used submarines to attack warships instead of commerce. While American submarines strangled Japan's economy, Japanese submarines searched for elusive carriers and battleships protected by destroyer screens, radar, and air cover. Merchant ships, the true lifeline of Allied strategy, were barely touched. And when Japan's isolated garrisons began starving, submarines were reassigned to supply missions. Combat boats carried rice instead of torpedoes and were lost in droves delivering cargo that couldn't change the outcome of the war. Even in anti-submarine warfare, Japan lagged fatally behind. They never established an effective convoy system, never developed enough escort vessels, and never built the radar and sonar platforms needed to hunt American submarines. Cultural attitudes didn't help. Escort duty was considered unglamorous, an assignment for second-rate officers. By the time Japan took merchant protection seriously in 1943, the damage was already irreversible. The contrast was stark. America had faulty weapons for nearly 2 years, yet eventually built the most effective submarine campaign in history. Japan had excellent hardware from the beginning, but used it in ways that had almost no strategic impact. And underneath it all lay a simple truth: strategy mattered more than technology. American submarines understood their purpose: destroy supply lines. Japanese submarines never embraced that mission. By the time the war neared its end, it was clear who had used their undersea forces wisely. The turnaround in America's submarine campaign came not only from better weapons and better strategy, but from the commanders who embodied the aggressive ethos Lockwood demanded. Men like Dudley Marshmoreton showed the fleet what a fearless skipper could accomplish. When he took command of USS Wahoo, he made it clear from day one that hesitation had no place aboard his boat. He even told the crew that anyone unwilling to take risks could step off before they sailed. No one did. His leadership inspired total confidence. Morton's patrols became legendary. He pushed Wahoo into dangerous waters like Wewak Harbor, places other skippers avoided because they lacked charts or expected heavy defenses. He relied on instinct, creativity, and relentless pressure. He coordinated attacks with his executive officer, Dick O'Kane, who later became one of the most successful submarine commanders of the war. Morton's aggressive tactics, daylight attacks, close-range firing, surface engagements became the blueprint for the new submarine war. One patrol in early 1943 defined this shift. Morton spent just 23 days at sea and fired all 24 torpedoes aboard Wahoo, sinking ships almost daily. He attacked an anchored convoy in shallow water, destroyed a destroyer that charged him head-on, and sank multiple transports. His daring was not reckless, it was methodical audacity. His results proved that decisive action, not cautious doctrine, won battles. But even Morton wasn't invincible. Wahoo disappeared on her 7th patrol, lost with all 80 hands in the narrow La Perouse Strait. Post-war records revealed she had been spotted by Japanese aircraft and sunk by depth charges. Morton died the same way so many submarine crews did, silently, far from home, without witnesses. Yet his legacy shaped the entire silent service. Other commanders followed his example. Richard O'Kane, who learned under Morton, went on to command USS Tang and became the most successful American submarine ace of the war, sinking 33 ships. His boat was ultimately destroyed by one of its own defective torpedoes that circled back, a tragic reminder that even late in the war, technology could kill the men who depended on it. O'Kane survived and later received the Medal of Honor. Samuel Dealey of USS Harder specialized in hunting destroyers, targets most skippers avoided. In a matter of days, he sank multiple Japanese destroyers, turning the hunters into the hunted. His boldness demoralized Japanese escort crews and disrupted entire convoy routes. Eugene Fluckey, commander of USS Barb, pushed submarine warfare beyond imagination. He sailed into harbors at night, launched torpedo attacks inside enemy anchorages, and even sent a team ashore to blow up a Japanese train, one of the only ground operations conducted by American submariners. By 1944, these commanders had transformed American submarines into a force defined by initiative, daring, and precision. They embraced risk not because they were reckless, but because they understood the stakes. Japan's empire could be dismantled ship by ship, convoy by convoy, and no other American combat arm had the reach to do it. Meanwhile, the losses continued. Boats vanished without distress signals. Mines, depth charges, aircraft, and mechanical failures claimed hull after hull. Each missing submarine meant dozens of young men lost forever at sea. But the crews never hesitated. They knew the danger and fought anyway. Submariners lived in steel tubes no bigger than the inside of a bus, breathed recycled air, endured crushing heat and constant stress, and went to battle knowing a single mistake, or a single lucky enemy drop, could end their lives instantly. Their courage made the submarine campaign possible, but their success depended on something deeper, a clear strategic purpose. American submarines were not hunting the enemy navy, they were hunting the enemy's ability to wage war. Every tanker destroyed weakened Japan's air force. Every freighter sunk starved its factories. Every cargo vessel sent down meant troops went hungry and machines went silent. Submariners weren't just sinking ships, they were collapsing an entire nation's war economy. Japan's submarines, by contrast, were wasted. They had long-range, strong torpedoes and advanced designs. But instead of strangling American supply lines, they chased warships or served as supply boats for isolated garrisons. Their technical promise became irrelevant because their mission was misguided. Even their successes, like sinking USS Wasp or Indianapolis, did nothing to slow the U.S. war machine. America's industrial strength was too overwhelming for isolated tactical victories to matter. By 1944 and 1945, the silent service had become the weapon Japan feared most, even though Japan lacked the means to counter it effectively. Radar-equipped aircraft, advanced sonar escorts, and coordinated convoys were common in the Atlantic, but Japan adopted them too late and too slowly. Their navy prioritized glory over necessity. Anti-submarine warfare was seen as defensive and unglamorous, not worthy of elite officers or advanced ships. The neglect proved fatal. American submariners paid an enormous price, but their victories were decisive. The war could not have been won as quickly, or perhaps at all, without them. By the final year of the war, the submarine campaign had achieved what no other branch of the US military could have done. Japan's economy, already strained by lack of natural resources, was collapsing under the pressure of constant shipping losses. Oil shipments fell to a fraction of their pre-war levels. Iron ore, rubber, coal, and food barely trickled into the home islands. Factories shut down for lack of fuel. Planes sat idle because training flights were impossible. Warships stayed tied to piers because there was no bunker oil to sail them. The most powerful battleship Japan ever built, Yamato, was reduced to a harbor monument, too fuel-starved to operate. When it finally sailed on its one-way suicide mission in 1945, it did so knowing it didn't have enough fuel to return. That was the reach of the submarine war. Silent boats, representing less than 2% of the US Navy, crippled an industrial empire of 70 million people. By early 1945, so many Japanese merchant ships had been destroyed that American submarines struggled to find targets at all. The sea lanes Japan depended on, the arteries carrying its economy, had been cut one by one until nothing vital remained. Japanese leaders later testified that the loss of shipping, more than any battle or bomb, was the greatest cause of their defeat. But victory came at a grave cost. 52 American submarines never returned. More than 3,500 submariners were lost, a fatality rate far higher than any other branch of the US Armed Forces. When a submarine was sunk, there were no survivors, no graves, no final messages, only a name added to a list and families left to wonder what happened beneath the waves. Yet the men kept going back to sea. They accepted the danger because they understood the stakes. Their patrols shortened the war, saved countless soldiers and civilians, and forced Japan's surrender months earlier than any other strategy could have achieved. Meanwhile, Japan's submarines, though technologically advanced, failed to matter strategically. The Japanese Navy used them for the wrong missions, chasing warships and running supply to doomed garrisons, while ignoring the merchant fleet that sustained the American advance. Even their rare victories, like sinking Wasp or Indianapolis, changed nothing. Japan never mounted a coherent commerce-raiding campaign, and by the time its leaders understood what needed to be done, it was too late. The American success was not just about technology or industry. It was about leadership, specifically Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood. He listened when others dismissed his officers' complaints. He fought the bureaucratic inertia that protected the defective Mark 14 torpedo. He ordered the unauthorized tests, challenged Washington, pushed for fixes, and protected the skippers who took bold action even when rules stood in the way. Without him, submariners might have fought the entire war with weapons that didn't work. Lockwood and his skippers proved a simple truth: wars are not won by perfect equipment, but by people who refuse to accept failure. The legacy of the Silent Service is one of courage, innovation, and relentless pressure. Its victories were won quietly. No newsreels, no parades, no cheering crowds, just steel boats slipping out of Pearl Harbor at sunset and returning months later with battle flags stitched full of sunk tonnage. Their impact reshaped the Pacific War. Their sacrifices remain some of the most profound in American military history. If you enjoyed this retelling, consider liking the video. It helps us share more hidden stories of World War II. Subscribe for more history that deserves to be remembered, and feel free to comment where you're watching from. Our growing community keeps these stories alive and meaningful.